I am Captain Nicole Pierce, 32 years old, United States Army. Standing in a civil courtroom in Fairfax, Virginia, my Class A uniform felt more suffocating than any combat gear I'd ever worn. My mother rolled her eyes the second I walked into that courtroom. It wasn't a subtle eye roll either. It was the kind that screamed, "Here we go again," as if I were an inconvenience in the perfect victim narrative she had constructed for herself. But then, Judge Marcus Brennan froze. His gaze lifted from the papers on his desk to my face, and I saw the recognition hit him like a freight train. "Wait a minute," he said slowly, setting down his pen. "These allegations are against you?" My parents had no idea who I really was. And honestly, that was the best part. What time are you listening to this? Let me know where you are in the comments below, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. The Fairfax County Courthouse is steeped in American history, its old brick walls having witnessed centuries of disputes just a short drive from the Pentagon. But to me, it wasn't a hall of justice. It was a tactical operations center, a battlefield. On one side of the room sat my unit, my lawyer, Mr. Thomas, a quiet, methodical man who looked more like a history professor than a litigator. On the other side, the opposing force, my parents. I assessed them like I would any high-value target. My mother, Diane, sat ramrod straight, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed from an expensive salon in Scottsdale, Arizona. She radiated the entitled confidence of someone who believes the world owes her everything, an attitude she wore like a designer handbag. Next to her was my father, Scott. He had the restless energy of a former high school athlete who peaked at 17 and had been coasting on the fumes of bitterness ever since. His glory days were long gone, replaced by a nervous agitation that made him constantly jiggle his leg. They didn't look at me. That would have required acknowledging my existence. Instead, they looked through me, as if I were just another piece of polished courtroom furniture, an inconvenient obstacle in their line of sight. Their entire strategy relied on me being nothing more than a ghost, a footnote in their story of parental suffering. Then came the first volley of the engagement. It wasn't a word, it was an act of pure, distilled contempt. As I took my seat, Diane executed the attack. It started with her eyes slowly drifting down to my feet, to the mirror shine on my military-issue dress shoes. A shine I'd spent an hour perfecting that morning. Her gaze crawled, deliberately, up the crisply pressed trousers of my uniform, pausing for a moment on the decorations adorning my chest, before finally landing on my face. A small, cruel smirk twisted the corner of her perfectly lipsticked mouth as her eyes completed their roll, a gesture so exaggerated it was a public performance. The message was as clear as a direct order: "You don't belong here. You are an embarrassment." For anyone who has ever stood in a room, proud of an accomplishment, only to be met with a dismissive sigh or a disappointed shake of the head from a parent, you know the brutal efficiency of that attack. It was a single, silent gesture that invalidated my entire career, my very identity. In that one, slow-motion eye roll, she erased Captain Nicole Pierce and tried to replace her with the nuisance of a daughter she always believed me to be. I felt the sting of it, a cold prick of humiliation. But years of discipline taught me to hold the line. I kept my posture straight, my hands folded calmly on the table in front of me, my expression unreadable. In a psychological war, the one who maintains their composure holds the high ground. And that's when the entire battlefield shifted. At the head of the room, Judge Marcus Brennan had been droning through procedural matters, his voice laced with the weariness of a man who had seen too many family feuds. He picked up the file related to our case, his eyes scanning the first page. Then he looked up. He saw my parents. Then his eyes moved to me. And he stopped. Everything about him changed. He sat up straighter, took off his reading glasses, and leaned forward. His gaze wasn't casual. It was a focused, professional assessment. He stared at the colorful array of service ribbons on my chest. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Meritorious Service Medal, and then his eyes shot to the nameplate on my right breast pocket. Pierce. I watched him connect the dots. The air in the room grew thick. My mother's smirk began to fade, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The judge put his glasses back on, looked down at the paperwork, and then back at me. His brow furrowed in utter disbelief. He set his pen down with a quiet, deliberate click. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice no longer tired but sharp, cutting through the silence. He looked directly at me. "Captain Pierce, these allegations are against you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It wasn't a procedural inquiry. It was a challenge. It was an expression of deep, profound skepticism, almost an insult to the very accusations written on the page before him. For the first time all morning, the bulletproof confidence of Diane and Scott Morrison began to crack. They exchanged a nervous glance. They had walked into this courtroom expecting to fight their forgotten, troublesome daughter. They were just now realizing they had entered a war zone where they didn't know the rules of engagement, and the presiding officer seemed to already respect the soldier on the other side. That's when the words I'd spoken in the opening statement echoed in my mind. My parents had no idea who I really was, and honestly, that was the best part. Their lifelong neglect, their willful ignorance of my existence, had given me an unexpected gift: freedom. The freedom to become someone they couldn't possibly comprehend. They never came to my graduations, my promotion ceremonies, or the welcome home briefings after a deployment. They saw my service not as a point of pride, but as a bizarre and slightly embarrassing hobby. Their invisibility was my greatest camouflage. They thought they were suing a broken little girl they'd left behind years ago. They had no intelligence reports on the woman I had become. They didn't know they were facing a captain in the United States Army, a soldier trained by one of the greatest military strategists of his generation, a woman who held every piece of intel necessary to win this war. And as I met Judge Brennan's steady gaze, a new question formed in my mind. What did he see? What was it in a name, in a collection of colored ribbons, that he recognized instantly? A truth my own parents had spent 32 years refusing to see. I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew it was a vital piece of the battlefield. And I knew its origins lay deep in the past, with the one man who had always been my commanding officer, my grandfather. The past is never truly past. It lives inside you, in the echoes of words and the shadows of empty chairs. My story didn't begin in that Fairfax courtroom. It began 32 years ago, in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. The first memory I have isn't really a memory at all, but a feeling, a sensation passed down to me through family lore. I was 3 months old. My mother, Diane, was 18. A restless teenager burdened by a life she hadn't planned. My grandmother, Helen, told me the story countless times, her voice soft with a sorrow that never quite faded. Diane, looking tired and irritable, had thrust me into Helen's arms. "Here, Mom, you take her," she'd said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I can't be dragging a baby around while I'm trying to build a life." There were no tears, no lingering goodbye. My father, Scott, stood behind her, hands shoved in his pockets, looking at a spot on the wall as if he were witnessing a business transaction. Even as an infant, I'm told I could feel the difference. My mother's touch was hasty, detached, like someone handling fragile cargo they couldn't wait to offload. My grandmother's arms were a fortress, warm, secure, and permanent. It was the difference between a layover and a sanctuary. And for my entire childhood, my parents were just a brief, turbulent layover. The most vivid ghost of my childhood appeared when I was 7 years old. It was Christmas, and our elementary school was putting on a nativity play. I had been cast as the angel Gabriel, a speaking role. For weeks, I practiced my lines until they were a part of me, my small voice filled with a self-importance only a second grader could muster. My grandmother Helen had sewn my costume, stitching love into every inch of the white satin and tinsel halo. I called my parents in Arizona, my heart pounding with excitement, to tell them the news. They promised they'd be there. They swore it. "We wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetie," Diane had chirped over the phone. The night of the play, the air backstage buzzed with the nervous energy of children and the smell of dusty curtains and cheap hairspray. Through a crack in the velvet curtain, I scanned the sea of faces in the auditorium, my eyes searching for them. I looked for my father's familiar build, my mother's bright blonde hair. Row by row, my hope began to curdle into a cold knot in my stomach. The chairs where they should have been remained stubbornly empty. Still, A part of me held on, whispering, "They're just running late." When it was my turn, I walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding me for a second. I delivered my lines perfectly, my voice clear and loud, projecting to the very back row, just in case they'd slipped in late. After the final bow, as my grandmother helped me out of my angel wings in the noisy classroom, the question I'd been holding back finally escaped in a small, trembling voice. "They didn't come, did they, Grandma?" Helen's hand stilled for a moment. She simply hugged me, a long, silent embrace that said everything. The next morning, the pain intensified, twisting from disappointment into something far sharper: betrayal. A classmate brought the local newspaper to school for show and tell. And there, on the society page, was a large, glossy photograph of my parents, Diane and Scott Morrison, smiling brilliantly at a black tie event, champagne flutes in hand. The caption beneath read, "The Morrisons at the Winter Wonderland Gala, supporting underprivileged children." I stared at the picture, the black and white newsprint blurring through my tears. They had chosen to support anonymous, underprivileged children over their own daughter. It wasn't just that they had forgotten, it was that they had replaced me. They had traded my small moment of pride on a school stage for a public performance of their own charity, a performance that earned them praise while I was left with an empty seat and a broken promise. Their rare appearances in my life were always like that, transactional and hollow. They'd show up for a birthday or Christmas bearing expensive gifts that were completely, painfully wrong. When I was 12, I won the district-level cross-country meet. I was so proud of my medal, of the strength in my legs and the fire in my lungs. For my birthday a week later, they presented me with a collector's edition Barbie doll, still sealed in its pristine box. "So you can learn to be a little more feminine," Diane had said with a condescending smile. The gift wasn't a gift, it was a correction. A message that the real me, the girl who loved to run, who felt more at home in sneakers than in dresses, wasn't good enough. I never opened the box. It sat in the attic for years, a silent monument to their misunderstanding, a symbol of the vast, unbridgeable distance between us. It was in the aftermath of that Christmas play that my grandfather, General Parker, found me. He discovered me hiding in his library, a grand room that smelled of old leather and history, surrounded by towering shelves of military books. He didn't offer me empty platitudes or tell me it would be okay. Instead, he sat down in the large wingback chair beside me. He pulled a heavy book from the shelf, one about the American Revolution, and opened it to a painting of Valley Forge. He pointed to the illustration of George Washington's soldiers, their faces grim, their uniforms ragged, huddled together against a bitter, snow-swept winter. "You see this, Nicole?" he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Honor isn't about winning every battle. Honor is about showing up for the fight, especially when it's cold and you think you're all alone." He looked from the book to my tear-streaked face, his eyes kind but firm. "I promise you this, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "In this family, you will never, ever have to fight alone." If you've ever had someone in your life, a grandparent, an aunt, a teacher, who showed up for you when the people who were supposed to didn't, please honor them by typing "I remember" in the comments below. And please press that like button to support all the grandparents who step up. That promise, made in the quiet sanctuary of his library, became the bedrock of my life. It was the constitution upon which I would build myself. While my mother taught me about absence and my father taught me about indifference, my grandfather taught me about honor. Not the kind you talk about, but the kind you live. The kind that shows up, stands its ground, and never ever leaves a soldier behind. My grandfather's promise became my silent marching orders. But with my college fund mysteriously drained by my parents' endless investments, I knew his promise of not fighting alone was a matter of spirit, not logistics. The actual fight was mine and mine alone. My life became a relentless military-style schedule, a campaign waged on two fronts. By day, I was cadet-in-waiting Nicole Pierce, an honors student at Washington Liberty High School, focused and disciplined. But the moment that final bell rang at 3 p.m., I became someone else entirely. I'd race to the locker room, shedding my school persona and pulling on the stained apron and non-slip shoes of a waitress. My second life was at the Arlington Diner, a bustling classic American joint off Route 50 that always smelled of sizzling bacon grease and stale coffee. For 8 hours a night, I navigated a chaotic battlefield of clattering plates, impatient customers, and endless coffee refills. I'd run on my feet until they were a dull, throbbing ache, the kind of pain that seeps deep into your bones. My shift ended at 11, but my night was far from over. I'd get home, the smell of the diner clinging to my hair, and study until my eyelids felt like they were lined with lead. Textbooks on calculus and American history would blur before my eyes. My alarm was set for 5 a.m. sharp. Before the sun rose over the Potomac, I was out on the quiet suburban streets, running miles, doing push-ups and sit-ups until my muscles screamed, chasing the demanding physical standards of the West Point fitness test. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. My fuel was black coffee and the ironclad will forged in my grandfather's library. I was a ghost in my own life, moving through the motions, driven by a single objective: escape and overcome. Then, one Friday night, my two worlds collided in the most spectacularly awful way possible. The bell above the diner door jingled, and in walked my parents, Diane and Scott, accompanied by two other couples who reeked of golf course money and suburban superiority. They saw me instantly. I was in the middle of a dinner rush, my apron splattered with ketchup, a stray piece of lettuce in my hair. I saw the look of pure disgust flash across Diane's face before she quickly masked it with a saccharine smile. She beckoned me over to their booth, her voice dripping with false sweetness but loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Nicole, honey, I had no idea you were working in a place like this." She let the words hang in the air. One of her friends, a woman with diamonds sparkling on every finger, let out a little tittering laugh. My father, Scott, did what he always did. He retreated into silence, staring intently at the plastic-coated menu as if it held the secrets to the universe. "Don't you feel embarrassed?" my mother finished, her voice a stage whisper. Embarrassed? I was exhausted. I was determined. I was a 17-year-old kid fighting for a future she had to build with her own two hands. But in that moment, under her judgmental gaze, all I felt was a hot wave of shame. She proceeded to order a glass of water, specifying, "No ice from the tap here, please." And then, as I placed it on the table, she deliberately knocked her fork to the floor. "Oops," she said, looking at me expectantly. I bent down, the blood rushing to my face, and picked up the fork from the sticky linoleum as her friends watched in amusement. It was a power play, a calculated act of humiliation to remind me of my place in her world, somewhere beneath her feet. That night, for the first time, I almost broke. I sat on an overturned milk crate in the back alley behind the diner, the foul stench of the dumpster filling my lungs. And I just cried. Tears of exhaustion, of anger, of the bone-deep humiliation I felt. The words replayed in my head. "Don't you feel embarrassed?" And for a terrifying moment, I believed her. I felt small and dirty and worthless, just a greasy spoon waitress who was foolish to dream of anything more. My resolve, which had felt like steel, suddenly felt as fragile as glass. But then I remembered my grandfather's other gift. My fingers fumbled in my backpack, past my textbooks, until they closed around the worn leather cover of a book he'd given me. It was a collection of speeches by Theodore Roosevelt. He had marked one page with a folded corner. Wiping my eyes with the back of my greasy hand, I angled the book to catch the dim light from the kitchen window and read the words I had memorized long ago. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." The words settled over me, not as a comfort, but as a call to arms. They were a transfusion of strength, a reminder of who I was. I wasn't the embarrassment, I was the one in the arena. My face was metaphorically marred by the grease and grime of the diner, my spirit sweating with effort. My parents, with their petty cruelties and country club friends, they were the critics. The timid souls who stood on the sidelines, pointing and judging, who would never know either victory or defeat because they never dared to enter the fight. A cold, hard calm washed over me. I was a soldier. This was my Valley Forge, and I would not surrender. A few months later, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. The return address was West Point, New York. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was my letter of acceptance. There was no shout of triumph, no tears of joy. Just a profound, quiet sense of peace. The battle was won. I had done it. I didn't call Diane or Scott. Their validation was a currency I no longer accepted. Instead, I got into my beat-up old Honda and drove to the one place that felt like home. I walked through the solemn, ordered rows of Arlington National Cemetery, the quiet reverence of the place settling my heart. I stood before the simple, elegant headstone of my grandmother, Helen, the place where my grandfather would one day rest beside her. The grass was a perfect, manicured green. I knelt down and placed the acceptance letter gently against the cool marble. "I made it, Grandma." "Grandpa," I whispered to the silent air, "I'm on my way home." The first 6 weeks at West Point are officially called Cadet Basic Training. Unofficially, everyone calls it Beast Barracks. And it lives up to the name. It's a crucible designed to strip you of your individuality, to break you down to your core components and rebuild you as part of a team. We were screamed at from dawn till dusk, pushed to the absolute limits of physical and mental exhaustion, and buried under a mountain of rules and regulations. For many, it was the purest form of hell they had ever experienced. For me, in a strange way, it felt familiar. The rigid discipline, the solitude within a crowd. I had been training for this my whole life. Where I struggled was not with the hardship, but with the trust. The entire system is built on relying on the person next to you. And I had learned long ago that relying on anyone was a fool's game. I kept my walls high, my focus lasered in on the mission, my interactions clipped and professional. Then I met my roommate, Sarah Jensen. Sarah was my polar opposite. A cheerful, rosy-cheeked girl from a corn farm in Iowa, she had a smile that could disarm a drill sergeant and a seemingly endless supply of photos of her sprawling, happy family, which she taped to her side of the room. My stoic silence and curt responses didn't faze her. She'd offer me half of her protein bar after a grueling march, ask about my day even when my only answer was a grunt, and talk about her home with a warmth that felt like a foreign language to me. She was the first person to chip away at the fortress I'd built around myself. As the leaves along the Hudson River turned from green to brilliant shades of orange and red, the first major holiday approached: Thanksgiving. The academy would empty out as cadets went home for a much-needed break. I'd already filed the paperwork to remain on campus, using the excuse that I needed to catch up on my studies. The truth, of course, was that I had nowhere to go. My grandparents were gone, and the idea of visiting my parents was about as appealing as another 10-mile run in full gear. One evening, while Sarah was on the phone with her mom, an email notification pinged on my laptop. It was from Diane. The subject line simply read, "Holiday Plans." My stomach tightened as I opened it. "Your father and I are going to Aspen for Thanksgiving week," it read. "The Smiths are hosting their annual party. If you want to fly out, you'll need to book your own ticket. But be aware, it's a black tie affair, and I doubt you have anything appropriate to wear." The email was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It wasn't an invitation, it was a test, one I was designed to fail. It was cold, dismissive, and managed to insult my financial status and fashion sense in a single sentence. I closed the laptop, the familiar cold ache of being an outsider settling in my chest. At that exact moment, Sarah covered the receiver of her phone and turned to me, her eyes bright. "Hey, Pierce," she whispered. "My mom wants to know if you have plans for Thanksgiving." I shook my head, unable to speak. "Well, she wants to know if you'd like to come home with me to Iowa. She says she makes the best pumpkin pie in all of Polk County." The simple, unconditional kindness of the offer struck me with the force of a physical blow. There were no strings attached, no judgment, no mention of black tie attire, just an open door and the promise of pie. A lump formed in my throat, and all I could do was nod. Flying into Des Moines and driving out to the Jensen farm was like stepping into another world. A Norman Rockwell painting come to life. The farmhouse was a large, welcoming wooden structure, with smoke curling from the chimney and the warm, delicious smell of baking bread wafting from the kitchen. Sarah's father, a tall, sturdy man with kind eyes and hands calloused from a lifetime of hard work, pulled me into a bear hug the moment I stepped out of the car. "Welcome to the family, Nicole," he said, and the way he said my name made it sound like I belonged. For the first time in my life, I sat at a dinner table that wasn't a minefield of unspoken tensions and subtle criticisms. There was laughter, loud and easy. I helped Mrs. Jensen peel potatoes in the kitchen, her hands moving with a practiced grace as she told me stories about Sarah as a little girl. I threw a football in the backyard with Sarah's two younger brothers, who tackled me into a pile of leaves and treated me like one of their own. No one asked about my parents. No one pried into my past. They just made room for me, accepting my presence as the most natural thing in the world. They shared their food, their home, and their warmth without asking for anything in return. That night, long after the house had fallen silent, I found myself sitting on the wide front porch with Mr. Jensen, sipping a mug of hot chocolate. The air was crisp and cold, and a blanket of stars was spread across the vast Midwestern sky, brighter than any I had ever seen. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, just watching the frost settle on the harvested cornfields. "You know," he said finally, his voice a gentle rumble, "out here, we have a saying. The land takes care of those who take care of it." He took a sip of his own cocoa. "I think people are the same way. Family isn't something you're just given. It's something you cultivate every single day with your presence, your loyalty, your hard work." I looked up at that endless starry sky and felt a profound truth settle deep within me. For so long, I'd been searching for a family in the barren soil of my birthright, trying to grow something in a place where nothing could take root. But maybe family wasn't about where you came from. Maybe it was about the people who fought alongside you in the same foxhole, the ones who shared their rations when yours were gone, the ones who had your back when the world was coming at you from all sides. My family wasn't in Aspen, dressed in black tie. They were right here, in the heartland of America, showing me that home wasn't a place you were born into, but a place where you were unconditionally welcomed. Years passed. I graduated from West Point, earned my gold bars, and became a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army. My life had found its rhythm in the structured world of the military, a world built on the principles my grandfather had instilled in me: honor, duty, loyalty. I was on a rare period of leave, staying at the old house in Arlington. My purpose there was singular: to take care of my grandfather. General Parker, the rock of my life, was now in his 80s, and his formidable strength was beginning to fade. His mind was as sharp as ever, but his body was failing him. Our days settled into a quiet, peaceful routine: slow games of chess in his library, tending to my grandmother Helen's rose garden, and listening to his old war stories, stories that were less about glory and more about the soldiers who never came home. It was a fragile peace, but it was ours. And then, one sunny Tuesday afternoon, that peace was shattered. A flashy candy apple red Mercedes convertible screeched to a halt at the curb, its engine a vulgar roar in the quiet neighborhood. Diane and Scott emerged, dressed for a cocktail party in the middle of a weekday. My mother wore a silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly paycheck, and my father had on a pastel polo shirt and loafers, the uniform of the perpetually leisured. They approached the house not like family, but like invaders, carrying a comically oversized gift basket from Neiman Marcus, filled with imported chocolates and exotic fruit jellies, things they knew perfectly well my grandfather, a diabetic, couldn't eat. Their arrival felt like a breach of our perimeter, a loud, garish intrusion into our silent world. Before I could even react, Diane swept past me through the open door and descended upon my grandfather, who was reading in his armchair. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice a syrupy, artificial sweet. She enveloped him in a hug that was all performance, her expensive perfume choking the air. "You look wonderful. We've missed you so much." Scott followed, giving my grandfather a brief, awkward handshake before his eyes started darting around the room, assessing the value of the antiques. They barely acknowledged me, offering only a cursory nod in my direction, as if I were the hired help. After a few minutes of hollow pleasantries about his health, questions they didn't wait to hear the answers to, they got down to business. They launched into a breathless, polished pitch about a once-in-a-lifetime real estate opportunity in Scottsdale. A luxury condo development, a guaranteed return. They painted a picture of extravagant wealth using buzzwords they'd clearly rehearsed. The only problem, they admitted, was a minor issue with funding. Several banks had turned them down. But now they had come up with a creative solution. That's when Scott turned his attention to me. For the first time in what felt like a decade, he looked me directly in the eye. "Nicole, we need your help with this," he said, his voice attempting a tone of man-to-man reasonableness. "You're an officer in the Army. You have credibility. Your grandfather is a 4-star general. If you both co-sign the loan, the bank won't be able to say no. It's a sure thing." I was speechless. A cold fury, silent and heavy, settled in my gut. They didn't just want money. They wanted to weaponize the two things I held most sacred: my honor and my grandfather's legacy. They wanted to take the name that grandfather had built through a lifetime of service and sacrifice, the uniform that I wore with immense pride, and use it as collateral for their greedy, half-baked scheme. They wanted to cash in on the very values they had spent their entire lives mocking and ignoring. My grandfather had been listening in silence, his expression unreadable behind his old, tired eyes. Now he spoke. His voice was frail, thin with age, but it carried the unmistakable steel of command. "The honor of this family," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "is not for sale, Scott." The rejection, calm as it was a lit match in a room full of gasoline. The masks of civility and concern vaporized. "You've always been this way," Diane shrieked, her voice suddenly shrill and ugly. "Always looking down on us. You never loved me. You only ever cared about this little orphan you took in." Then Scott turned on me, his face contorted in a sneer, and he pointed a finger at my chest. "Don't you get high and mighty," he snarled. "You're just the bastard stray he brought home. If you don't help us, I will make sure every single person in this family knows what an ungrateful wretch you are." Ungrateful. The word struck me like a physical blow. The accusation of being ungrateful, coming from the two people who had deserted their most fundamental duty, the two people who had abandoned their post as parents from day one. In that moment, something inside me, a dam of restraint that had been carefully constructed over 3 decades of silence and endurance, finally cracked. The years of swallowing my pain, of turning the other cheek, of maintaining my composure, it was all over. I looked at them, really looked at them, not as my parents, but as what they were. Two selfish, desperate people who would burn down everything I loved to warm themselves by the fire. My voice when I spoke was not loud. It was low, devoid of all emotion, as cold and sharp as ice. "You have 60 seconds to get out of my house," I said. "Now." My command froze the room. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt like you could snap it in half. Diane and Scott just stared at me, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. They had only ever known one version of Nicole, the quiet, compliant girl who absorbed their neglect and disappointment without a word. They were now face to face with a stranger. "What did you just say to me?" Scott snarled, recovering first. He took a menacing step toward me, puffing out his chest in a sad imitation of the athlete he once was. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I held his gaze, my own feeling like chips of ice. I said, I repeated, my voice even lower, colder than before. "You have 50 seconds. My eyes flicked to the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room, its pendulum swinging in a steady, indifferent rhythm. Tick, tock. The quiet countdown was more terrifying than any scream I could have uttered. My grandfather, frail as he was, shifted in his chair. He pushed himself to sit up straighter, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that felt like a shield at my back. He was a silent sentinel, bearing witness. Diane, always more attuned to shifts in power, seemed to realize the ground had given way beneath them. The dynamics of the room had been irrevocably altered. She grabbed her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. "Scott, let's just go," she hissed, her voice tight with panic. "There's nothing more to say here." As they turned to leave, a lifetime of suppressed words surged within me, demanding to be heard. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about truth, a final, clarifying order of battle. "Listen closely," I said, my voice cutting through their retreat. They stopped at the doorway, their backs to me. "From this moment forward, you have no claim on this family, not its property, not its honor, and you most certainly do not have a claim on my loyalty." I took a breath, letting the finality of my words sink in. My loyalty belongs to the United States Army, and to the man sitting in that chair, the only father I've ever known. Whatever relationship we might have had is officially terminated. I walked to the front door and closed it firmly behind them, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still on the doorknob, expecting to feel a wave of grief, of regret, of loss. But it never came. Instead, a feeling I hadn't realized I was missing washed over me. Freedom. The crushing weight of their expectations and their disappointment, a burden I had carried on my shoulders since I was a child, was finally gone. I felt light. I turned back to the living room, my breathing still a little ragged from the adrenaline. My first thought was for my grandfather. I rushed to his side, worried the confrontation had been too much for his weak heart. But the man I saw in the armchair was not frail. His body might have been failing, but his spirit was blazing. He was trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from a righteous fury. And he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was a look that went beyond the love of a grandfather for his grandchild. It was a look of profound respect, the look a commanding officer gives a subordinate who has exceeded all expectations under fire. He reached out a shaky hand and grasped my arm. He nodded slowly, a small proud smile touching his lips. "Well done, Captain," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "You defended this position." He squeezed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "That's my commanding officer." That single sentence, from him, my mentor, my hero, was worth more than any medal the Army could ever pin on my chest. It was the only validation I had ever needed. It was absolution. It was permission to finally be my own woman, my own soldier. Later that evening, after I had helped him to bed, I went back to the library. The room was my sanctuary, the place where he had taught me to play chess, to think 3 moves ahead, to anticipate an opponent's strategy. My eyes drifted to the formal portrait hanging above the fireplace. General William Parker, in his full-dress uniform, his 4 stars gleaming on his shoulder boards. Scott's parting shot still echoed in my ears. "I will make sure everyone knows what an ungrateful wretch you are." It wasn't an idle threat. It was a declaration of war. They would not stop. They would try to poison the well, to slander my name, to attack the honor he and I held so dear. This wasn't the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new campaign. And a good soldier never waits for the enemy to make the first move. Have you ever had a moment where you knew, deep in your bones, that you had to stop being silent and finally fight back? If you have, just type, "The dam broke," in the comments. And hit that like button if you believe that standing up for yourself is the ultimate act of strength. I walked over to the antique mahogany desk, picked up the phone, and dialed a number I'd kept stored for years, a contingency plan for a war I'd always hoped I'd never have to fight. A calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Law offices of Mr. Thomas," the voice said. My own voice was steady now, all traces of the earlier confrontation gone, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. "Mr. Thomas, please," I said. "This is Nicole Pierce, General William Parker's granddaughter. I believe it's time we had a talk." My call to Mr. Thomas was the first shot fired in a war that had been brewing for 30 years. In the days that followed, my grandfather's library ceased to be a quiet place for reflection. it transformed into a tactical operations center, a TOC. Though my grandfather was largely confined to his worn leather armchair, the moment we began to plan, he regained the commanding presence of a four-star general. The fatigue fell away, replaced by a sharp, strategic fire in his eyes. "Nicole, bring me the large whiteboard from the study," he ordered one morning, his voice clear and firm. I rolled it in, and with a black dry erase marker in his trembling hand, he began to map out the campaign. At the top, he wrote in bold letters, "Operation Legacy." He drew a diagram outlining our objectives, our assets, and our threats. Under threats, he listed Diane, Scott, and their unknown legal counsel. Under assets, he wrote, Mr. Thomas, tangible evidence, and key witnesses. He sketched out a timeline, identifying critical decision points and potential enemy courses of action. This wasn't a messy family squabble to him. It was a military operation with a clear objective: to defend the honor and legacy of our family name against an insidious internal threat. For the next several weeks, under his direct command, I became his intelligence officer. My mission: to gather the intel we needed to win. He directed me to the meticulous files he had kept for decades, his record-keeping as precise as a battlefield log. I plunged into a painful archaeology of my own life. I sorted through canceled checks he had written to Diane, credit card statements detailing lavish vacations and shopping sprees he had paid for, and a thick file of printed-out emails from Scott, each one a thinly veiled request for a loan for some new, doomed business venture. Every document was a piece of the puzzle, a quantifiable record of their dependence and his generosity. I photocopied, scanned, and cataloged everything, organizing it all into chronological binders. The evidence was overwhelming, a mountain of data that told a story of relentless taking. The hardest part was the photo albums. My grandfather instructed me to go through them, not for nostalgia, but for evidence. Establish a pattern of absence, he'd said. So I did. I pulled out photos from my high school graduation, me smiling in my cap and gown, flanked only by my grandparents, my commission ceremony at West Point, the gold bars being pinned on my shoulders by my grandfather, his hands shaking with pride. Holiday gatherings, birthdays, award ceremonies, photo after photo showed the same story. Helen and William Parker were always there. Diane and Scott were ghosts, conspicuously absent from every milestone of my life. Each smiling picture of me with my grandparents was a silent, powerful testament to my parents' abandonment. The process was agonizing. Each photograph was a fresh reminder of a moment they chose not to share, a new twist of the knife in an old wound. But with each piece of evidence I filed away, I felt that old pain transforming. It was no longer just a source of grief, it was becoming ammunition. One afternoon, Mr. Thomas came to the house. My grandfather didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had me lay out the key intelligence points, and then he presented his strategy regarding his last will and testament. Mr. Thomas, this document is not an act of punishment, the general stated, his voice holding its old parade ground authority. It is a statement of meritorious service. In the military, we reward loyalty, dedication, and outstanding performance of duty. Captain Pierce has served this family with honor for 32 years. My daughter and her husband, on the other hand, went AWOL from their duties on day one. He leaned forward, his gaze locking with the lawyer's. My will is simply a reflection of each individual's service record. It allocates the family's assets accordingly. He had brilliantly reframed a legal document into a military performance review, a concept that any judge with a service background, like Judge Brennan, would understand implicitly. It wasn't about disinheritance, it was about recognizing who had actually served. The weeks turned into months, and as winter approached, the general's health declined rapidly. The fire in his eyes began to dim. A few weeks before he passed away, he called me into the library. He was weak, his breathing shallow, but his mind was still on the mission. He pointed a trembling finger to a small, intricately carved wooden box on the desk beside him. It was an old humidor, one I remembered from my childhood. That's it, he whispered, The words a struggle. My reserve weapon. I picked up the box. It felt heavy in my hands, weighted with more than just its contents. Only open it, he instructed, his breath catching. When the enemy thinks they're winning. When they've overextended their lines. Deploy it then. I clutched the box to my chest. I didn't know what was inside, but I knew it was more than just papers. It was his final move on the chessboard. It was his unwavering faith in me. He had spent his final months preparing me, equipping me not just to fight, but to win. He had given me the intelligence, the strategy, and now the secret weapon. Holding that box, I made a silent vow to him and to myself. I would not fail this mission. I would not let him down. The trial began exactly as my grandfather had predicted. Their strategy wasn't based on facts. It was a full frontal assault of pure emotion. Their lawyer, a slick man named Richard Palmer, painted a sob story for the ages. He called my mother, Diane, to the stand first. She glided up, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, and delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. She spoke of a tyrannical, controlling father who had used his money and influence to steal her only daughter's affections. She wept as she described feeling alienated and unwelcome in her own childhood home, a place she was now being unjustly cut out of. I watched the jury, and I could see her narrative taking hold. A few of them were looking at me with expressions of pity, not for me, but for her. Scott took the stand next, playing the role of the devoted, long-suffering husband. He spoke in a low, wounded voice about how he had only ever tried to protect his wife from her overbearing father. They portrayed my grandfather as a senile old man in his final days, easily manipulated by the granddaughter who had conveniently isolated him. They painted me as a cold, opportunistic vulture, circling my grandfather's fortune and poisoning him against his own flesh and blood. Palmer's closing argument to the jury was a masterpiece of melodrama, ending with a flourish. They ask you to believe that a daughter, a loving daughter, would be cast aside for a stranger. We ask you to believe in the sanctity of family. I sat perfectly still through it all, my hands resting on the table, my posture rigid. I felt their lies washing over me, a tide of filth meant to drown me. But I held my ground. I trusted the mission plan. Then, it was our turn. Mr. Thomas rose, and the entire atmosphere of the courtroom shifted. He didn't bring emotion. He brought data. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm and factual. "We're not going to talk about feelings. We're going to talk about facts." On the large screen behind him, a slide appeared. It was a simple bar chart titled Parental Visits, Final 5 Years. It showed a stark, undeniable reality. In the last 60 months of my grandfather's life, Diane and Scott had visited him a grand total of 3 times. Each visit, according to the home caregiver's logs, lasted less than an hour. The next slide was a detailed financial summary. Page after page of bank statements and credit card bills, meticulously organized, detailing over $500,000 that General Parker had given them over the years. Mr. Thomas put on his glasses and addressed my mother, who was now squirming in her seat. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his voice cutting like glass, "you testified under oath that you felt unwelcome in your father's home. Yet, these records show that during that same period, your father paid for 3 of your family vacations to Hawaii, the lease on your husband's BMW, and his annual membership dues at the Scottsdale Country Club." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "Is that your definition of being alienated, ma'am?" Diane stammered, her face turning blotchy and red. She muttered something about gifts and family support, but the damage was done. Her story of victimhood was collapsing under the sheer weight of the evidence. Next, Mr. Thomas called a parade of witnesses who dismantled their second claim, my grandfather's supposed senility. A 2-star general who had served under him, his primary care physician, and his end-of-life caregiver all testified to General Parker's sharp mind, fierce will, and unwavering lucidity until his very last days. But the decisive blow, the strategic masterstroke my grandfather could have never predicted, came next. The defense calls Judge Marcus Brennan to the stand as a character witness. Mr. Thomas announced. A shocked murmur went through the court. Judge Brennan looked stunned. Counselor, that is highly unorthodox, he stated. I am not calling you in your capacity as a judge, Your Honor, Mr. Thomas clarified smoothly. I am calling you in your capacity as Colonel Marcus Brennan, United States Army, retired. A look of understanding dawned on Brennan's face. He agreed. He took the stand, not as a judge, but as a fellow soldier. He recounted attending a national security conference with my grandfather just 4 months before he passed away. We spoke for over an hour about evolving military strategy in Afghanistan, Brennan told the jury, his voice resonating with authority. General Parker's strategic mind was sharper than most active duty officers I know. The suggestion that he was mentally incompetent is not only false, it is an insult to the legacy of one of the Army's greatest leaders. The testimony was devastating. Richard Palmer, seeing his case in flames, made one last, desperate attack. He turned to me. Captain Pierce, isn't it true that in all your life, you have never once said the words, "I love you," to my clients, your own parents? Before I could answer, Mr. Thomas stood up. Objection, he said, not to the judge, but to the entire narrative. Permission to present our final piece of evidence, Your Honor. Brennan nodded. Mr. Thomas walked to our table and picked up the small carved wooden box my grandfather had given me. He placed it on the witness stand and opened the lid. Inside was a stack of old letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. These, Mr. Thomas announced, are letters written by a teenage Diane Morrison to her parents, General and Mrs. Parker, years before she met Scott. He carefully unfolded one, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. He began to read aloud, his voice clear and steady. I hate you both. I wish I was never born into this stupid, miserable Army family. I'm counting the seconds until I turn 18 so I can get away from this hellhole and never look back. He read another. Don't expect me home for Christmas. I'd rather be anywhere else on earth than in that house with you. He looked up from the letters, his eyes finding my mother in the stunned silence. Diane's face was as white as a sheet. She looked like she had seen a ghost, the ghost of her own past, resurrected to condemn her. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Thomas said quietly, his voice devoid of malice but full of damning truth. It seems that feeling like you don't belong in this family is not a new sensation for you, is it? After Mr. Thomas read those letters aloud, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete it felt like a vacuum. The fight was over. Diane's carefully constructed fiction had been utterly annihilated by the truth, written in her own angry teenage hand. Judge Brennan didn't take long to deliver his verdict. He dismissed their lawsuit entirely, calling it a frivolous and baseless action motivated by greed. But he didn't stop there. He looked directly at Diane and Scott, his expression one of cold contempt. In the United States Army, we have an honor code, he said, his voice ringing with authority. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. He let the words sink in. You have done all four. You lied under oath, you attempted to cheat your way into an inheritance, and you tried to steal the honor of a great soldier. This court will not tolerate it. He ordered them to pay not only their own legal fees, but mine as well. A final, crushing financial blow. I listened to the words, the gavel strike, the pronouncement of our victory. But I didn't feel the elation I had expected. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying release. Instead, a profound emptiness washed over me, a bone-deep exhaustion. The war was over. The enemy was defeated. But the battlefield was still littered with the wreckage of what might have been, and I was just a soldier, tired and ready to go home. As Mr. Thomas and I were walking out of the courtroom, a hand grabbed my arm. I turned. It was Diane. Her perfect makeup was now a ruin, streaked with what I realized, with a jolt, were real tears. Her face, stripped of its usual mask of superiority, was just a mess of desperation. "Nicole, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry, okay? I was wrong. But I'm still your mother. You can't do this to me. Please." Scott stood a few feet behind her, his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask of impotent rage. He said nothing. The word, mother, coming from her lips now, felt alien and hollow, a title she had never earned. And for the first time, looking at the wreck of this woman before me, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel the old, familiar pain. All I felt was a strange, sad pity. Pity for a woman who had spent her entire life chasing the wrong things: money, status, glamour, and had ended up with nothing of real value. I gently, but firmly, removed her hand from my arm. I looked her straight in the eye, my voice quiet, not rising with emotion. "Have you ever visited Grandma Helen's grave?" I asked. The question caught her off guard. She just stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. "What?" "Do you know that her favorite flowers were peonies?" I continued, my voice remaining level. "Did you know that Grandpa was allergic to strawberries? Did you know that I got pneumonia during my sophomore year at West Point and spent a week in the hospital?" With each question, she took an involuntary step back, as if my words were physical pushes. The truth was a force she couldn't withstand. "You don't know," I said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "You don't know any of those things because you were never there. You gave birth to me. That is a biological fact, but you were never my mother." I took a breath, the truth finally setting me free. My mother is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. My mother was the one who taught me how to garden, who read to me every single night, who stayed up late to sew the wings on my angel costume. I saw a flicker of understanding, of real, painful comprehension in her eyes, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. "I forgive you," I said, and the most surprising thing was that I meant it. The anger, the bitterness that had been my constant companion for so long, finally dissolved. "I'm not forgiving you because you deserve it. I'm forgiving you because I deserve to be at peace. For 32 years, I have carried the weight of your disappointment and his indifference. Today, I'm putting that weight down." I looked from her tear-stained face to my father's stony glare. "But that peace comes with a price, and the price is that I can no longer have you in my life. The battle is over. The war is done." I paused, drawing a final, steadying breath. "Don't call. Don't write. We're finished." I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing in the long marble corridor. I didn't look back. I could hear her start to cry behind me, a raw, wounded sound. But for the first time in my life, her tears had no power over me. They were just noise. I kept walking, marching forward toward a future that was, for the first time, entirely my own. I was alone, but I was finally, completely free. That night, back in the quiet sanctuary of my grandfather's house, I sat in his armchair, the silence a comforting blanket. I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. My fingers hovered over the entries. One read, Diane, the other, Scott. For years, they had been listed as Mom and Dad, but I had changed them long ago, an act of quiet rebellion. I stared at the names, symbols of a connection that had only ever brought me pain. There was no grand ceremony, no final angry text, just a simple, quiet action. I selected the first name. A small menu popped up. My thumb moved to the word delete. I pressed it. A confirmation appeared. Are you sure? I pressed delete again. Then I did the same for the second name, and just like that, they were gone. It was a small act, a few taps on a glass screen, but it felt like the final, definitive end of the war. A quiet, personal armistice. I had won the public battle in the courtroom, but this was the victory that truly mattered. The years after the trial were quiet. The echoes of that battle faded, replaced by the demanding rhythm of my military career. I rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a lieutenant colonel in command of a field artillery battalion. The inheritance my grandfather left me wasn't something I saw as a prize to be enjoyed, but as a resource to be deployed. I used a significant portion of it to establish a nonprofit foundation in his name, the General Parker Honor Fund. It provided scholarships for the children of service members, but I added a special provision, a mission born from my own scars. The fund also offered pro bono legal and psychological support for soldiers entangled in toxic family disputes back home. I had taken the ugliest battle of my life and transformed it into a sanctuary for others, a firebase of support for soldiers fighting wars on two fronts. The news about my parents came years apart, in two brief, professionally detached emails from Mr. Thomas's office. The first reported that Scott had died of a massive heart attack on a golf course in Scottsdale. The second, a few years later, informed me that Diane had passed away after a long, private illness. I read each email, paused for a moment, and then archived it. There was no joy, no sorrow, just a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter of history had finally, irrevocably, closed. 15 years after that day in court, I received an invitation to be the commencement speaker at West Point. As a full colonel, the honor was immense. I stood on the platform at Mickey Stadium, looking out at the plain, the hallowed ground where I had drilled and marched. Before me sat the graduating class, a sea of thousands of young men and women in their immaculate gray dress uniforms, their faces bright with hope and determination. In my hand, I held a carefully prepared speech about leadership and modern warfare. But looking at their faces, I set the prepared remarks down on the lectern. And I just told them my story. I spoke of the empty chairs at a second-grade Christmas play. I spoke of the dismissive eye roll in a Virginia courtroom. And I told them about a grandfather who taught me that loyalty is thicker than blood. Your first family is now the United States Army, I said, my voice carrying across the field, clear and strong. And in this family, we have a sacred creed. We never leave a fallen comrade behind. I want you to take that creed and apply it to your entire life. Choose your own family, your own foxhole buddies, with care. Build your life around people who will show up for you when it's cold and you feel like you're all alone. Become the soldier that others can depend on, both on the battlefield and off. That is the essence of honor. More years passed. The world turned and my journey continued. One day, in a formal ceremony at the Pentagon, I found myself standing at attention as the Secretary of Defense approached me. With a gentle click, he pinned the first star of a brigadier general onto my shoulder epaulet. As the weight of it settled on my uniform, my thoughts weren't on the power or the prestige. Instead, my mind drifted back to a quiet afternoon in a sunlit library, to my grandfather looking at me over a chessboard and telling me I had the heart of a warrior. In that moment, I knew I had fulfilled my mission. I hadn't just defended his legacy, I had carried it forward. I had become the fifth star in the Parker family constellation, the four he had earned and the one I had forged myself, hammered out of duty, honor, and a love that was unconditional. The story ends as it began, in the garden of the old house in Arlington. I am retired now. The uniform hangs in my closet, a proud relic of a life of service. The peonies, my grandmother Helen's favorite, are in full bloom, their heavy pink heads nodding in the warm afternoon breeze. And I'm sitting at the small patio table, at the very same chessboard where my grandfather taught me the game all those years ago. Across from me sits a little girl with bright, curious eyes and a familiar, cheerful smile. She is Lucy, the granddaughter of my old West Point roommate, Sarah Jensen. Her family, my chosen family, is inside, filling the old house with the sounds of laughter and life. Lucy frowns in concentration, studying the wooden pieces on the board. "Grandma Nicole," she asks, looking up at me, "how do you win?" I smile, a deep, genuine smile of peace and contentment. I reach across the board and gently tap the head of her king. "You don't have to win every battle, sweetheart," I tell her softly. "You just have to know what you're fighting for. And you must never, ever leave your soldiers behind." I look around at the beautiful garden, at the house filled with love, and I feel the presence of my grandparents all around me. That, I say, is the real victory. The legacy of General Parker had been defended. It had been passed on, and now, in the heart of a new generation, it was continuing to grow. And so, my war finally ended, not with a battle, but with a quiet peace in a garden. Thank you for listening to my story. My grandfather taught me that the greatest legacy isn't what you leave for people, but what you leave inside them. If my story has left a little bit of strength or hope inside of you, then his legacy, and mine, will continue to grow. Please, share in the comments one value someone special left inside of you. Your stories give us all strength. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of resilience and hope. Thank you for being here.